welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Crowenston. I'm publisher and CEO of Research Money, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to this webinar. It is called Stimulating Business Innovation, Changing Models for Greater Long-Term Success. And we're so thrilled to be partnering with the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I'm going to introduce the CEO, Ted Hewitt, in a minute. I'm going to hand it over to him, but I have a couple of announcements. I want to remind everyone or tell people that we have another webinar in 2 days on Thursday from 12 noon to 1:30 with Fonds de Recherche du Québec, FRQ, on innovating innovation. They have a new model of innovation in Quebec. So we're doing one, and I welcome you all to go to the Research Money website and go to events, and you'll find that one, register. We have about 100 people registered for that as well. And I also want to announce our 23rd annual Research Money Conference will be in Ottawa in April on the 24th and 25th at the National Arts Centre, and you're all welcome to come. We have not launched a registration yet. We will be doing so this month. Super early bird registration rates, so it'll be cheap for you to come. So watch out for that. Just watch our Innovation This Week newsletter, and we'll announce all that coming. So without further ado, I want to thank SSHRC for this. This is a follow-on webinar to our conference last April. And some of our partners have been doing post-conference webinars based on the theme that we looked at. So I'm thrilled to introduce Ted Hewitt, the president of Social Science Humanities Research Council. Ted is our host, and he's also our moderator. So over to you, Ted, and I'll come back at the end.
Thanks, Jeff, and hopefully everybody can hear me. Just great to see you all and to be here with our panelists. So I'm going to introduce right away. So we've got that on the table. So I want to start with AJ Agrawal, who's the Jeffrey Tabor Chair in Entrepreneurship and Innovation and Professor of Strategic Management at the U of T's Rotman School. So welcome, AJ. And he's also founder of the Creative Destruction Lab. I really like that name. It's very cool. Very cool. Hope you can talk a little bit about that. Hayden Shaw, who I had the pleasure of meeting not that long ago, I think in London, Chief Executive of the British Academy. Welcome, sir. And Tracy Loriot, Associate Professor of Critical Media and Big Data at Carleton University. So bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue notre séance. So happy to have you here. So pleased to see we're joined by so many colleagues. You know, it's the subject of this webinar, of this session. You know, I would classify as like one of my pet peeves, I guess. Not the topic, not the discussion, maybe so much, but when you see how much funding, for example, how much money that SSHRC invests in topics related to business and innovation and the economy, it's phenomenal. And yet, quite often when we talk about business and innovation, things always tend to focus back on the technology. You know, if only we had another BlackBerry, you know, this would be great for Canada. If only we had more technology companies. If only we had more STEM graduates. No offense, we need lots of STEM graduates. But, you know, it's not really, I mean, my personal opinion, it's not so much really how innovation works, right? I mean, in the real world, and I've worked in the real world like a lot of you have. And when I think about it, Ed Greenspan and I from Public Policy Forum, we wrote an op-ed that has been little noted or cited a few years ago on moonshots and innovation. And the point we made, I thought quite clearly, was that when you talk about innovation, particularly with respect to business in Canada or elsewhere, there's 5 key ingredients, and you know we all know how, you know what these are. And what we pointed out are the 5 things that have to happen. So you have to have an idea, obviously, or a technology. You have to be able to sell it. You have to be able to actually make it. You have to market it, and then you have to make money, right? You have to get people to buy it. Well, most of that stuff in there in the innovation piece really relates to our sector. It relates to people and the way that people relate to people. And so we made the point quite forcefully and used some examples. And yet still we have this discussion and people say, well, that's all well and good. And yeah, I guess social sciences and humanities, a lot of businesses rely on that for HR. But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe it's time, we had the discussion. We had a broader discussion. We try and really make the point. There's lots of ways that business can benefit from greater interaction with our social scientists and our humanists in order to make for great products that are going to sell and actually, make money and enhance prosperity and well-being in Canada. So we wanted to bring together today an amazing group of panelists to probe a bit further, explore concretely how this untapped resource within the social sciences and humanities can better help to move innovation along and help determine ways to better integrate the things that we know from our disciplines to stimulate business innovation for longer term success. So everybody kind of stands in a slightly different position, which is great. That's exactly what we want. So AJ, being at the helm of a global science-based startup accelerator program, you're going to have a good idea what makes companies successful. Tracy, as digital humanist, I think you can provide great insight into the skills required to make sense of our data-driven world. And Heaton, your lens through the British Academy's recent work on better understanding how social science contributes to the economy, in particular what you call SHAPE in the UK. All of this provides a really, really good place to start. So once again, I want to welcome everyone to the panel. We're going to get started. We're going to do a fairly quick round of questions that I'll moderate to kind of get everybody going, and then we're going to leave time at the end, I promise, for questions, because it looks like we got a great audience and lots of knowledgeable people. I know lots of people who aren't shy about asking questions and making comments. So why don't we get started with you, Heaton, in terms of the British Academy, and when you talk about SHAPE, what do you really mean? Like, what does that mean to you? And we're gonna try and keep around 5 minutes or so, and we'll just keep moving.
Sure, thanks, Ted. And I mean, the British Academy, for those of you that don't know, we're the National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences in the UK, with fellows largely based in the UK, but also some international fellows around the world. And as you say, we've been working on this concept of SHAPE, which is a counterpoint to the term STEM. When you've looked at the language we've had for our own disciplines, HSS, or I've even heard BASH and STEAM, which I never liked, which
never
was
liked STEAM.
So SHAPE, social sciences, humanities, and arts for people and the economy is something we came up with, and actually we just put it out there. It seems to be being picked up all over the place. I think not only in the UK, but in Australia and New Zealand and other places too. And I think one of the nice things about it as a phrase is it's an active verb. So actually we are shaping the world and so on. But anyway, I don't want to focus too much on that. What I wanted to do was just lay out a few things that the British Academy is doing, both in terms of the narrative around this agenda and analysis. I think the first point to make is that the UK is an 80% services economy. And this does not tend to be lodged in the minds of politicians. So there's still really a kind of view in the political mind that actually we're a kind of manufacturing type economy, and that's the sort of model that tends to be rolled out when they're thinking about economic productivity and growth. But actually, if you look at the UK economy, we've got strengths in the creative economy, in finance, in law, in education. I mean, our university export by international students is enormous, and so on. So I suppose that kind of very headline point about thinking about a kind of new framing of an economic narrative. So this is not actually, don't forget about us, it's you're missing what the future looks like, which I think is really important in terms of the reframing. And our president, Julia Black, recently published a review about R&D happening in the creative economy, and it shows creative businesses spent 3.3 billion pounds on R&D, and that's 3.2% of their GVA, which is higher than the average UK business, which is at sort of more 2.3%. So that this is a fast-growing sector in the UK and an important sector. And then this leads me on, I suppose, to say our disciplines have got a vital role to play in economic analysis, and that can only really come from SHAPE. So, for example, we've been working with our Department for Business and with our Treasury. I convened the most senior officials there very recently for a roundtable that I chaired on concepts like, what's the future economic industrial strategy? We're seeing a whole series of economic shocks. What can we learn from history around all of this? There's a big discussion happening around geography and place in the UK. So you need economic geographers and demographers to be thinking about all of these things. And one thing that's missing is how we measure innovation. So actually, we are, if you look at companies like Netflix, we've looked at consumer behavior in some of our supermarkets. So if you look at the gaming industry, there's actually a lot of R&D going on, which is humanities and social sciences. But this tends to be undercounted by the statisticians. And in fact, under certain definitions of R&D, it's actively excluded in UK definitions. So our view is that, as is always the case, if you can get better metrics that will bring alive actually what's going on. And of course, we also need the economic analysis around how innovation funding works. And Ted, you spoke upon this, but I suppose our broad point is that diffusion is social. And so you need a better understanding of what are the mechanisms for that so that you can get the right kinds of investment. And we've been also making the case about tech adoption being a really critical issue. So there's a big focus in the UK at the moment on new technologies, on AI, quantum, etc. And we've been saying, yes, that's all very important, but also let's not forget about actually there's a lot of digital exclusion, both at individual level and also at organizational level, that sort of adoption and diffusion isn't there, and that's as critical a kind of issue because we're not making the most of the technologies we already have, let alone new tech.
Exactly.
And sorry.
So many good points. No, go ahead, finish off. Because
I just thought I'd mention, we did this project called Future of the Corporation, which was again reviewing what's the purpose of business, and making the argument that the kind of notion of shareholder value, actually, if you take the kind of 2000 year long view, shareholder primacy has been really just a kind of 50-year focus, and actually in the longer run, profit and purpose have always gone together. And so looking at notions of social innovation, alternative business models, and so on, and then we're backing that up with new types of funding ourselves. So we've created innovation fellowships, enabling some of our funded researchers to go out and work with businesses or policymakers. We're looking at a notion of venture fellowships as well, giving people in our disciplines the ability to go out and run new businesses. And I think, as you know, I was saying it just before we formally started last week. The UK hosted this AI summit, which I was fortunate to be at Bletchley Park. And I think AI is a good exemplar of, here's a technology, but actually you need social science and humanities in there right from the start to say, what is it for? What are the values that we're imbuing into the technology? What are the biases contained within it? How do we maintain the social license so that, unlike, for example, with genetically modified foods in Europe, where that scientific technology wasn't taken forward because we lost the social license, we need to maintain trustworthy technology, as it were. So, and we can see AI, what it's doing to copyright, and there's a tension there with some of our creative industries at the moment. So those are just some of the things that we're up to, which I hope, I'm not claiming we have all the answers, but hopefully that's some food for thought.
Well, you got all the questions. It's you really started us off well, and as you speak, it's just reminds me of what we all know, or many of us know, that everyone else seems to have forgotten or doesn't want to know. 80% of the economy is services. What does that suggest about how business is done in the service sector, and who should be driving that? We don't measure really all of the things that our disciplines do provide and in terms of research to business. In fact, I had many meetings. I had meetings in Ottawa, I had meetings in Paris at OECD. They don't measure anything linked really to social science input in research. For example, nothing to do with marketing research, which many companies do and banks do, and they spend a lot of money on this. It's not even considered as research. So you really, and the difference between the technology and the advanced technology and what's in the technology, which always gets me. I got my iPad here. I won't open it for you and show the apps, but every single thing in there has got something to do with other people or culture, right? I'm reading newspapers. I'm communicating with my friends. I'm watching movies, and this is my day. This thing wouldn't have a use as sophisticated as it is if it were not for the content, and generating that content takes research. Anyway, Tracy, you're a digital humanist. Like, what's that about? How does this really, aside from my poor attempt to kind of work that in with my iPad example, how can this really help us, in our understanding of how to promote innovation in business?
So I'm a critical data studies scholar, first and foremost, which means that I qualitatively study, if you will, quantitative culture. And because my background is geography, GIS, geomatics, and spatial data infrastructures, I have actually worked with data and worked with all kinds of technologies, which means that I understand the social and technological interconnections between data and technology. And I was part of some of the first research projects. So there was a time where if you did technology and data research, you couldn't get any SSHRC money. And if you did, society and technology research and you applied to NSERC, you couldn't get any money.
No.
And so that was one of the issues that we had. And we're still, I would say, in the social sciences, we love social theory, but we don't think of social theory in the application of the study of data and technology, for which AI is one of the technologies for that. So I still think we are a little bit behind in that side. So in terms of what I do is I do qualitative research about quantitative culture, but I also work in a very transdisciplinary way with the Carleton University Immersive Media Studio and Architecture, where we're building a digital twin, or I might work with Open North, a nonprofit organization here in Ottawa, in Montreal, but at national scale, that is looking at smart cities, and we developed an open smart city strategy, and I'll explain what we did with that. I might also be working with a group, a transdisciplinary team based out of UBC, which is a SSHRC-funded project called I Trust AI, that includes artificial intelligence experts and Canada's research chair on machine learning as part of that project, and also Luciana Duranti, who's the only person in the history of Canada that's ever received 5 consecutive SSHRC partnership grants. And that is because of such important work in archives and archival prevention and archival practices and archival professionals in the digital space. And, so the challenge that we're looking at are really quite extensive. So if we think of research and development, for example, in the I Trust AI project, Mohammed Majid from UBC, he's been developing really fascinating artificial intelligence language models that are questioning and challenging Anglocentricity in AI development, and the idea that everything is in English, and very little is in French, and they certainly don't work for any of the Arabic languages or most of the African languages, and they don't even recognize them. And there's, we know that in Africa there's 27+ languages, and most of the artificial intelligence systems do not recognize them. So the fact that we are doing this social science work that might be looking at linguistics, that might be looking at language patterns, might be partnered with archivists around the world. And we're realizing that most of the models and the tools that are being built can't work in countries that don't have English as their primary language. And so how can artificial intelligence help the archives? Well, this is one of the areas where we're working to develop tools and technologies to actually deal with archival principles, based on 14th century diplomatics, embedding those systems and the tools and the technologies, and working with artificial intelligence people to develop those tools, considering those kinds of models. At the same time, with the Carleton Immersive Media Studies here at Carleton University, SIMS, they're building a digital twin. Well, as we're building the digital twin, we're embedding some of the values in those that Heaton was talking about. How can they be transparent? How can they be accountable? How can they be in the public good? How do these things not become the largest surveillance apparatus in the world? Because digital twins have the potential to become big surveillance apparatus models. How do we influence the industry that is developing building information models and those systems to actually embed fair, accountable, transparent types of processes in their systems? How do they make them more open so that we can actually use them? And what is the role of open source and open data and open AI in those systems? And how do we influence that sector? But also to build tools with that in mind. And so for me, it's always about how can we build tools that are in the public interest, that are for the public good, that can help us actually create better, more sustainable and fair and just societies. And what's the role of the social sciences in doing that? In the work with Open North, we were very concerned that smart cities were becoming a new data enclosure movement. So we'd worked actively in many parts around the world to open data and implement open science and open government and open data and open standards and open specifications. Then suddenly we see the corporatization of smart city space by many of the big actors and the big platforms. And we're saying, wait a minute, we're seeing cities now closing data within these particular environments and also building these systems in the absence of science. You know, if we think of Internet of Things application technologies, they were always developed in science and geography and geomatics and those kinds of spaces. Once they become corporatized, the science disappears and the data get enclosed. So we developed something called the Open Smart Cities model. And that model actually was funded by Natural Resources Canada here because it was difficult to develop a proposal for SSHRC to be able to do this, again, because of some of the disconnect on the technology practices and the level of community. But what we were able to do as a result of that was to develop an Open Smart Cities model to demonstrate that openness ought to be mapped onto these particular systems. We developed benchmark instruments where cities can self-assess themselves according to this Open Smart City maturity models. And then we had 25 policy briefs, everything from smart technology abuse. So think of your smart house maybe in a domestic dispute situation and who ought to deal with that. Progressive procurement practices when it comes to technology. Other issues such as sustainable modeling or shared transportation. What does it look like? So if you hear the alliteration of the things that I'm talking about, they're all very complex technological systems that interface with society on an ongoing basis. And our argument is that the social sciences are the social theory that help inform these models and to construct them in a way so that they're of mutual benefit. But that requires transdisciplinarity. And I know I fortunately got to grow up in only transdisciplinary research labs as a student that were funded by SSHRC. So think of the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center or the I Trust AI projects at UBC. And I've only ever gotten to work in research labs that were transdisciplinary that allowed me to bring data and technology and social theory together. But that is not always the norm. And one last thing to maybe give a little nod to Haytan over across the pond very early in the morning. This here model that I have in my wall is from the Fair Work project that comes out of the Oxford Internet Institute. And this group of social scientists here have unionized gig labor around the world and have developed fair work practices so that this group of people can be protected in the gig economy. So the social sciences have lots to contribute. Some might say that's adversarial to innovation. And we would say, well, innovative policy and innovative justice along with innovative tech can benefit all of us. And I think it really requires this social science thinking and also social science thinking that is not afraid to play with tech and that is not afraid to move away from technological solutionism and instrumentalism and willing to work in a transdisciplinary way. And I can talk to you about a whole bunch more examples in this space where that work is happening. Sure. And I'm very excited that we're here having this conversation.
No, that's great. And just before we move to AJ, I can't resist. Somebody said to me the other day that in a conversation, one of their colleagues had said that, ethics and all these social considerations were really the killer of an innovation. I thought,
Yeah,
okay.
people say that, but we don't. We can counter that. We have lots of research to demonstrate the reason we have sustainable development, or we have, all of those things are R&D to keep us all better. So
you got it. So,
yeah.
AJ, you work in a lot of different sectors and spheres. As a researcher studying AI, you work in innovation, entrepreneurship. And the development of the creative destruction lab. I'm really interested to see where you sit on all this, particularly around the unique role that social sciences and humanities can play in innovation. So maybe you could share a few of your insights to this point, and then we'll keep going.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ted, and Hitan and Tracy. I enjoyed listening to your comments, and everyone for joining in. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and a lot of my research has been funded by SSHRC. And I'll tell you a little bit about Creative Destruction Lab, because at some level, Creative Destruction Lab was born out of my SSHRC-funded research. My early doctoral student research was on the question of what explains the variance in the commercialization of university science. Why does some university science end up moving from the lab bench into products and services that benefit society, and other research ends up in technical peer-reviewed journals, but never makes it over the fence from academia into the economy. And then so that eventually led to my work in creating the Creative Destruction Lab. So people have a sense of it. It's now a reasonable scale. I founded it in 2012. The mission of Creative Destruction Lab is to enhance the commercialization of science for the betterment of humankind. And the inputs are traditionally people from science and engineering. So I'm a social scientist, but the lab, the thesis of the lab, I would say the question that we started with was a puzzle. And it was that if you were in outer space and looking down at planet Earth, and what you were looking at was the geographic distribution of capital applied to early stage science-based projects, what you would see is a very big spike over Northern California, Silicon Valley, and then small hills in other places. But if you were to be in the same spot in outer space, and instead of looking at the distribution of capital, you were looking at the distribution of breakthrough ideas, the distribution would look really different. There'd be a small hill over Northern California, but there would be similar size hills in many other cities, especially once they're population adjusted. And so the question is, if scientific breakthroughs are the seed corn of tech companies, why is the distribution of capital so concentrated in Silicon Valley? And so there's a variety of theories. Some people say, well, the Silicon Valley, the ideas are better, and that's just empirically not true. Using things like citation-weighted publication counts and patent counts and things. Another theory as well, the people in Silicon Valley have more entrepreneurial hustle. That may be part of it, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the full thing. There's a lot of people trying very hard to turn their inventions into. And so the thing that we focused on was something very basic, which is we had a view that there was a missing market for judgment. And what we refer to as judgment is when you're looking at an invention and figuring out how to turn that into a business, or any entrepreneur when they're starting a business, they have 1,000 things they could be doing to build their business. They don't have the bandwidth to do all those 1,000 things, so they have to pick a few things from the list. And picking some things from the list, to prioritizing, is what requires judgment. And it sounds very easy, but it's very hard. and most people pick the wrong things. And so they work on those things for a few months. They realize, oh, that's not the right thing. And so they come back and they pick a few more things. They work on them for a few months. That's not the right thing either. And so after enough time, they run out of capital and energy and sanity, and the thing typically collapses. Statistically, most like the outcome is failure. So, so the idea of Creative Destruction Lab was to take these technologists and to help them connect to people that have good judgment. And in our view, the people with the best judgment were people who had done it before, who had gone from having an idea to a prototype to a product, raising capital, building a team, generating revenues, growing the revenues, and ultimately, having extracting some of the value from their asset through either selling the business or taking it public. So I won't go into all the details of how it's designed, but we drew in a fair amount of what's called market design theory from economics to design a market for judgment. When we launched the Creative Destruction Lab, we had a goal of creating $50 million in 5 years of equity value from university-based science. And so the goal was 50 million in 5 years. And now we are at about 12 years and 29 billion in equity value from the companies that have come through Creative Destruction Lab. There's Creative Destruction Labs in the UK, at Oxford, in Paris, in Germany, in Estonia, across Canada, from UBC to Dalhousie, and some in the US. It's a not-for-profit program, and the key thing in there is there's a bunch of social scientists who are involved in the process of working with the scientists who have built a product, like or the core of a product, helping them turn that into something that's actually financeable. So 3 points. My first one is just the design of Creative Destruction Lab is a result of about a decade of little over a decade of SSHRC funded research. The second point is just building on the two comments that came earlier around artificial intelligence. AIs are incredibly powerful computational statistics machines that do predictions. To use those predictions in anything useful, either making decisions or taking actions, requires the prediction and judgment, and machines have no judgment. And judgment is a very big category, and that is effectively the domain of not just the social sciences, but the humanities, the arts. And as we hand over more and more of the prediction work that we're used to doing a lot of that computation in our head, we start outsourcing more and more of that to machines. That the role of judgment will become increasingly important. And so to some extent, if you believed in AI rippling through the economy the way some people do, then you could make the argument that we are way over indexing on the sciences, the STEM subjects, because the most valuable resource in the AI economy will be judgment. And that comes from, in fact, even the humanities, even more so than social sciences. My last point is one that I will throw out as a challenge to the research community in social sciences and humanities. My sense is that the question of this panel is, how we feel like the poor ugly cousin of the STEM subjects. We're underfunded relative to them, and when people talk about business and the growth of the economy, they focus on STEM, and they underappreciate us. And my question is, what role do we have to play in that? Like, to what extent is it our fault? And I would offer two comments here. One is, I feel like in the social sciences and humanities, there is in my view, an unproductive culture of being anti-business. There's an anti-business culture. And so why would we expect to be included in business if people have a derogatory attitude towards, and if business is effectively, you can't sell something unless you serve a customer, unless you provide something of value. So you have to have empathy for somebody in order to care about what's the thing. It's hard to build something that people want. I work in this area with all these entrepreneurs who are foregoing a regular job and an income, and many of them living in a basement, eating ramen noodles, trying to turn their invention into a thing. It's very hard. Most of them fail. And so business is hard. And I think social scientists and people in humanities, in my view, we have a cultural problem that is, it's fashionable to be anti-business. And so that's my first point on that. And then I'll just conclude by, I have a colleague, she's an economist at the University of Virginia, who recently wrote an article that was published in Science magazine. She co-authored with a few others. And effectively, what she's encouraging, she wrote it for economists, but I think it could be similarly written for anybody. And she said, when you get your next sabbatical, consider taking a position, doing your sabbatical in a government agency. And the reason she said that is because, as an economist, in our profession as researchers, we're all kind of entrepreneurs in the sense we all pick our research topics and we pick our questions. And many times, I would say the majority of times, we pick questions that aren't relevant to business. And so her point was, if you go and spend some time in a government agency, you'll learn what's relevant to policymakers. And so if you're going to then, after your sabbatical, go and spend 7 or 8 years, working on stuff in whatever your research trajectory is, maybe you'll be influenced to pick a research question that is actually relevant to policymakers. And so you can contribute to understanding whatever that policy issue is better, but be guided by what are the policymakers considering is relevant. So, obviously we don't want everybody working on applied things. It's important that we have 1,000 flowers blooming and people picking all kinds of things. But perhaps in the social sciences and the humanities, we could do with, a larger fraction of us focused on questions that, have have direct impact on things that, whether it's on the policy side or on the business side, so that we don't put all the blame on how come people don't pay enough attention to us, because we're paying attention to them and working on research that is relevant to society. I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Now we're getting to the heart of the matter here in some sense, and Tracy's raring to go. I want you to think, I'm going to put you on first, Tracy, and then Hayden again, but a couple of things, we're kind of getting to the crux of things, but if there is this divide or this gap, what do we need to do in terms of training, for students? What should they be learning? And secondly, what should we be doing as academics and colleagues, in terms of and maybe it's not all on us. This is a good point to make as well. What do we need to do to create a better rapprochement? Because even if you don't, I would say, AJ, even if you're not necessarily pro-business, there's lots of stuff you're doing that could be very relevant to business and that they should be paying attention to, even if you didn't talk. But how do you sort of bridge the gap and move these two worlds a little closer together? So Tracy, I'll start with you, and then I'll go back to Eaton. Go ahead.
So the work I do bridges that gap all the time. The problem is, in many cases, is that work that I do is actually not valued, I'm sorry to say, by social science granting councils. It's really not. Unless I write a really deep, social and technological theoretical framework that sounds brand new, that will meet the theoretical criteria of the adjudicators, I go nowhere fast. So a lot of the work that I do is work that's theory and applied theory, but theory and applied theory doesn't get adjudicated very highly because it's not considered new, it's not considered innovative, and it's not considered useful in the context of social science adjudication practices. So that's one thing that's really, really important. We need to look at our adjudicators, because our adjudicators are often actually not well trained to understand at least in the social sciences, that research and development gets articulated slightly differently than regular social science problems. So that's one. Two, I would be concerned to prescribe everything must have a real world application in policy and government if you're doing social science research. I'd be loath to do that. I would be loath to do that in the natural sciences, to say everything has to have an R&D outcome. There is a place for research. Think of the RNA vaccine. We wouldn't have had that. Those researchers were in obscurity in the early 80s because nobody believed them, nobody cared about them, nobody funded them. But yet look at us today, what we're relying on, right? Fortunately, they persisted and we were able to have a vaccine that works for us. But it was hardly ever funded because it just didn't meet the peer review of the day. So I think there needs to be room in both the social science and natural sciences and the Canadian Institute for Health Research for places that don't seem to have a direct application that eventually will have a direct application. The other thing is the community groups are involved with many, many things. SSHRC has had funding to allow communities to actually be the leads on partnership developments and partnership grants. To the best of my knowledge, almost no community-based organizations have received that funding because they don't articulate in a way that the social theorists can actually understand them, and they're considered to be too applied and not theoretical enough. So I think there's a problem lies also elsewhere in the funding mechanisms, who adjudicates, the nature of the questions, and also, dare I say, the diabolical interfaces that people have to deal with when they're working with these systems. Also, though, what I do agree with AJ is there is generally, at least in the context of Canada, we are a natural resource-based economy. We have cities, and between the cities is a whole bunch of space and a whole bunch of natural resources. We have the potential for battery mining up north. We're selling off our forests for really cheap. We could be doing, other sustainable energy systems. We could be locating cloud computing centers here, and they could be carbon neutral. Those are social science informed issues that can be dealt with in a research and development kind of context, but I don't know where one gets funding for that, to do that particular kind of research. Every now and then it might be a small MyTax grant and so on, but also how do we take a lot of the good critical research and help those researchers shape what they're saying into a language that those who build things and do things understand, and vice versa. So I think the transdisciplinary piece is something that we really need to work on. We've been talking about since the 70s and the 80s about those bridge builders between industry, science, and the social sciences. That is usually a function that doesn't result in research papers. And so we don't put money in our granting systems to that function of people just bridge building and social integration, if you will, of knowledge. And people who are good at that, or those coordinated integration types of activities, can't publish in the tenure and promotion system because that's not something that is valued as a function. And it's hard to write a really good peer-reviewed paper on something that we've known about for a very long time, but we don't actually support. So I think that there is something in our ecosystem. I think it's not just loathing, but it's really difficult to do this work. I mean, I'll give you an example here on campus. I'm in public affairs. I'm affiliated with the Institute for Data Science. If I want to teach a course on data science, ethics, and society, who pays for it? Is it public affairs? Or is it computer science? Are each other doing each other a favor? How does the money move between the departments? It took me 8 years to get that course on the books. And that is a basic fundamental knowledge production environment where if we as social scientists are critiquing the production of technology, the only way we can change the production of technology in more innovative ways is to work with the people who think through and make those things, and to spend time with people who do those things. But that is much easier said than done. And I can give you a lot of examples of it. I think, if we're having this conversation, I think there's a really interesting opportunity here to revisit how we organize disciplines, how we organize funding, how we think of adjudication, and the kinds of research problems that we work on. But I would not preclude open social science research and mandate them into a particular pigeonhole, but I would certainly open it up. And I would certainly love to see something that enables this really deep interdisciplinary work, and that it gets supported, and the roles and functions to enable transdisciplinary research to move forward be developed and supported in granting types of functions. Sorry, I got excited there because these are things that I think about a lot. They're related to the work that I do a lot. And every time I do this work, I encounter a barrier somewhere, some of which is what AJ said, but most of it is structural, and sometimes through the granting councils.
I totally agree. And the council's initial response on your last point is the New Frontiers in Research Fund, which has a completely different structure.
And I know that one. I've been successful with that one. Or my Stephen Fye, who I work with, and the Digital Twin Project has been successful in that space. And that's one of the projects that we are talking about here, or that I mentioned.
We give a little plug to the Science Policy Conference coming up next week. We have a special session just on that with researchers to talk about what they've been able to do that they couldn't, under the old model. But you're right. This is pretty systemic, and there's a lot going on. Hayden, let's hear from you, and then we'll go back to AJ. And then I got people asking questions, firing away here. We're gonna get onto that shortly. But go ahead.
Well, thanks very much. I want to say I really enjoyed both contributions that we heard, and I think AJ's point about judgment being critical is really important, and I think is not one that is, it's not in the narrative enough at the moment, and I think that's something we should continue to develop, and all of us should rally behind that. Ted, you asked a few questions. I mean, in terms of training for students, we published something off the back of the work we've done around the future of the corporation. What does this kind of thinking about a wider notion of business mean for business school curricula? And I presented that at the recent conference of our business schools. And what was really interesting is that business schools are all moving in that direction, certainly in the UK, in terms of their conversations. So there feels to me to be a kind of alignment, a kind of new generation of people. And, when AJ was talking about people working in their basements, eating noodle soup, profit is a motivator, but it's not the only motivator for a lot of these small business people. And, we've got to think about people in the round and think about business in that round. He also asked about bridging the gap. And I think, the kind of funding issues that Tracy has talked about, I think are certainly live in the UK as well, to the extent that people think about research that is focused on business-related matters. It's often thought through in a kind of STEM type way, and more innovation funding that could link with social science and humanities, I think is a gap. But interestingly, also when we're talking about working more with policymakers in the UK have started publishing what are known as the areas of research interest. So every government department now publishes what its areas of research interests are. And I think that's been a really useful first step in just actually developing that rapprochement between research community and policy. Not to say, of course, that all policy must be driven by applied stuff, but it's helpful to know if you want to do something applied, what might be useful. And then I think I come back partly to, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's our disciplines that actually can provide insight on these issues. So in the UK, a major problem we've had is low productivity growth now for over a decade, really since the financial crisis. And it's really humanities and social science research that can unlock what is underneath that, as it were. And technology is only one component. I mean, we have issues around planning and infrastructure and all sorts of things, but and skills as well. So unpacking that, I think, is a real issue which we can help with. And then the final thing I wanted to mention, which is sort of turning it around a little bit, is as we live in a much more digitized society and economy than we did 10 or 20 years ago, this changes the nature of humanities and social science research and offers all sorts of opportunities to better understand the world around us. But a critical factor in all of this will be access to the data. And we're increasingly seeing, in the old days, essentially data was held by government and or was created by the research community. Now that, a lot of golden high quality data is held by technology companies or by the private sector. And how can we build those relationships so that we can actually access some of that data for research purposes? We've seen large technology companies, for example, the social media companies, I think have largely not been very keen on doing that. It's been a bit of a roller coaster. It's gone up and down, but for the most part, there hasn't been an enormous amount of access. And if we're trying to judge the questions of, what does social media mean for our democratic processes, for example, some of the access to that data will be really important. So I think there's a rapprochement to be done on the data as well.
That's great. So we're going to come back around to you, AJ, and feel free just to kind of carry on. But something just came to mind because we've been kind of beating ourselves up a little bit here. I mean, what about business? I've worked in the private sector. I've worked a lot with the private sector and universities. I mean, it's not like this is an easy thing. How much needs to be done from the business side to create better linkages and to get business more interested in at least trying to work with companies, to work with universities and work with researchers and research and engage a little bit more. And we know the stock answer is, well, you have to work at the speed of business. Don't even get me going on that because, I used to work developing contracts with companies like Imperial Oil, and how many years did that take? But is there things that companies could be doing to open up a little bit more, let's say, to build bridges? Anyway, anywhere you want to go, AJ, because we know there's lots of questions coming and there'll be lots of chances to get this out.
So I guess two things. My first point is just to I want to make sure I may have not been clear enough in light of Tracy's point. I absolutely support and encourage basic research that's not applied. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I don't think that's important. There's a great book by Donald Stokes, Pasteur's Quadrant. And the point I was making is that I think we could do with more social scientists in Pasteur's Quadrant. So that is a 2x2 where on one axis we have motivated by advancing the frontier of knowledge, like basic understanding. And on the other axis is some intended use. And so you could have research that is totally focused on enhancing understanding and has no concern for use. That's basic research. And then you have other research that's focused on making things that are practical, have use, and have no interest in extending our understanding. That's pure applied. Pasteur's Quadrant is this one where there is both a motivation to enhance understanding and there's some kind of use. And so the point I was making there is in terms of our portfolio, our distribution across the different quadrants, that in my view, in the social sciences, and frankly, in the humanities, like I think there is going to be a renaissance of application in philosophy to our applications of machine intelligence. Like we are going to have to rethink what it means to be human in terms of what things are in the domain of machines versus humans. And philosophy will go from really the backwater of academe in terms of its kind of direct application to society to front and center, I suspect, in the coming years. And but that means we need philosophy departments who are willing to tackle these these modern problems. And I'm not advocating for everybody to, but just so we need some. So that's my first point. My second point here is in your response to what can business do? In many respects, Ted, I'm a Chicago economist in the sense that I believe in market forces. I don't think companies should do anything. I think a bunch of them will and a bunch won't. And the ones that do embrace social scientists, and in some cases, draw from humanities, if those things actually contribute to their ability to achieve their mission, whatever that mission is for society, then they will prosper relative to their competitors that don't.
Mhm.
So if I look today, you know, even the undertones of some of the comments that have been made already were disparaging of the large tech companies. And yet those tech companies hire more social scientists than anyone else. And so they have found the virtues of social science. And all these other, companies that are in some sense outdated, they haven't realized that social scientists are able to interpret data. They've been trained in how to interpret data in ways that we didn't need to in the past because we didn't have that kind of data. And so, and it's not just data, like it's not just empirical social scientists. But my point is, when you say what should companies do, I think companies should just do what they always do, which is trying to deliver the thing that they are designed to deliver for society as well as possible, at as low as cost as possible, to make it affordable for people. And to the extent that what we do as social scientists increase their ability to do that, then they should adopt, integrate, and those that do will prosper, and those that don't will fall behind. So that's my view.
Good point. Some
Yeah.
people though have flipped that around, including the dean of a big innovation school, University of Texas. Last time I was down there, he said that, well, researchers should follow the same path. They should do what it is they do best. Don't worry about linking with industry. Don't worry about commercializing. That's really for somebody else to figure out. Where we often have this model, and we often hear in government, researchers, they need to be more entrepreneurial. They need to be more open to business. Not so sure about that. Maybe they should just do what the heck it is they do best. And then maybe we should be thinking about how some other structure helps to build those bridges, as opposed to the traditional tech transfer industry liaison models that we see in universities right now. It's quite interesting. But anyway, I say that to be controversial. We're going to do go ahead. Answer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would align with that university president with one caveat, which is, in other words, I do think that researchers should just do what they do best. We have a lot of latitude in choosing our questions, and so my caveat would be that researchers still choose their questions, that they just get exposure to things, so that when they choose their questions, if they want to choose things that are relevant, or if they wanted, that they even know what relevant is. So in other words, let's say if you're a political scientist or a sociologist and you want to work on things that you think are relevant to climate change, that having exposure and understanding what are the frontier issues in climate change, not just in the literature, but in terms of people that are actually working on it. That when they choose their question, and I agree with that Texas professor, that once they've got that background, then they choose whatever they choose and do the very best they can as a researcher, not worry about the business implication.
Okay,
So there's new
ahead.
disciplines: critical data studies, critical platform studies, surveillance studies. There is platform studies, etc., that are at the intersection of society and technology. They're sometimes in the humanities, they're sometimes in media studies departments, sometimes they're in criminology departments, and so on. And those groups of theorists actually would not agree with the assumption that you just let business do what they're supposed to do. Because if you just let business do what it's supposed to do, we would have had sidewalk labs in the city of Toronto. And it would have been a 360 surveillance apparatus with little conversation about data governance, data sovereignty, what is private, what is public space, and who's your mayor when it's, 1-800 call Google when you need the plumbing repaired in an IoT system that's completely owned and operated by a platform company called Sidewalk Labs. Or we would have a lot more predictive policing systems or facial recognition systems, for that matter, that misidentify and misattribute people if we just let business do what it did, which was exactly the case with Amazon and IBM and Microsoft with their facial recognition systems. And so just letting business do what they do in the absence of regulation and in the absence of environmental issues like the carbon neutral GPU systems that I was talking about, or other things, means that we have no influence in the business sector and no collaboration in the business sector. And there ought to be this dynamic conversation about the implications, the social, political, and environmental implications of data, who they affect on the ground. For example, in Canada, we have almost no regulation of data brokers, right? Multi-billion dollar companies who know a lot about us and we know almost nothing about them. Our industry classification systems can't track them. We don't know how we don't even have an understanding in the economy. If we're going to quote the economists, we almost have no understanding in the economy of how data shows up on an audit stream if you're a data-based organization. If we start looking at the procurement databases, we can't find them, et cetera, right? So people like myself were like, well, we would like to have more transparency in this big data sector, in this corporate surveillance sector, in a sector that the government procures from, at all three levels of government procure from data brokers. What happens with mergers and acquisitions? So for example, Bell Canada just bought Environics Analytics. What does it mean when the major technology provider and a telecommunications company also is a data broker today? And how does that line up when we have this concentration? We already have the concentration of power in these spaces, and there's some great research done by Professor Dwayne Winsek here, a great partnership grant that looks at mergers and acquisitions in the media space. So that research needs to be done. And that research ought to be critical, and that research ought to inform the public space so that businesses actually are better and they do less harm and more good. And so I think that's a really exciting role for the social sciences. And that's the role that I was talking about earlier that I would like to see more support. That's a really complicated transdisciplinary space. And in terms of the pasture model, I think it's really very interesting as well. I would say all quadrants have value, but when we want to bring the quadrants together in the pasture of ideas where they can be mutually beneficial, then I think we need some support to support that kind of transdisciplinary activity. And I think it's okay to work with business. I work with businesses all the time. I live in Silicon Valley North. When we look at smart city ecosystems, it's about saying, yes, we want smart city technology. Yes, we want this technology to do well, but we want it to be open. We want it to be fair. We want it to be trustworthy. We want it to be accountable. We want it to be transparent. We want it to fulfill a purpose and not have some kind of mission creep for it to become, a big surveillance apparatus. And we want some controls over those systems. And that all the disciplines of surveillance studies, data studies, et cetera, platform studies are the people who've been doing that really important informed critique. They're the people sitting at the regulation tables right now. We see scholars sitting there. Again, work that's not valued as research, but who are sitting at Senate subcommittee tables trying to inform the artificial intelligence regulation. New data brokerage legislation just came through in Canada as well. And we just signed on finally, it's had its third assent in Canada, the beneficial ownership where we can start following the money. That is a combination of scholarly research as well as activist research, as well as engaged research, as well as research with the NGOs in the country who are saying, look, we have issues with rising rents in Vancouver and Toronto and Ottawa. We know that Canada is known for snow washing. It's a beautiful place to launder your money. And so what kind of systems do we create to counter that so that it's better for Canada? Because if we just let those business do what they're always doing, we're not going to be able to afford to live in our own country anymore. So to me, that is really important research that gets done. But again, research very difficult to articulate in a social science granting council. But if you look at the actors involved in those spaces, they're all social science researchers and scholars in these different domains. And I think it's time that we start recognizing those other interesting domains and those particular actions, and also recognize that kind of service in terms of tenure and promotion in our universities, because that kind of service isn't always necessarily valued in tenure and promotion. So again, it's like, as you were saying earlier, it's a systemic system, and we do have some systemic barriers in advancing these particular kinds of activities. And we're fortunate, you know, I was mentioning Open North earlier. With Infrastructure Canada Smart City Challenge, the Open Smart Cities research was able to inform that challenge. And so what did we have? We had theory of change coming from cities and their challenges. We had their gender-based analysis plus in those systems. We had a promotion of public engagement in the creation of those complex technological systems. That's a really exciting space where scholars have been involved to shape the social and technological environment in our cities across the country, with those who are trying to implement this in the absence of knowledge. And I think working with business and working with cities, I even work with facilities and plant management here, because they're trying to implement the digital twin, but the people who manage our facilities are not educated in dealing with complex technological systems. So how do we deal with that labor gap and that knowledge gap? And how do we retrain people in these spaces so that they can become more able to work with these particular technologies and not be, you know, kind of groomed out of these places because they're not able to do that? And then how do we hire people who also have those combinations of skills? I think we have so many wonderful opportunities here, but I would certainly never let business just do what business does, because if the history of our societies has said that if we just do that, we're in really, really big trouble. From environment, social, et cetera thing. But well, you know what I'd love to hear the questions.
Yeah.
Just before we go to the questions, I just have to, I mean, that, and, you know, Tracy's remark there was a little bit, in my view, way off base. I was not suggesting, of course, any business not following regulations and laws. And so that assertion is not at all what I was making. Of course, industry needs to be regulated. Of course, companies need to follow the laws. You know, that's not at all what I was saying.
That's
All right,
great.
let's
I'm
go to
glad you
questions.
clarified
Well,
that.
and we want to bring it back to the focus, which was how, right, social
Yes.
sciences and humanities can work with business and what the barriers are to
Mhm.
that. So, but okay, Hayden, you got to have the last word here, because I got to go to these questions. Like we're going to spend all day here. Like we don't start moving along. So, last word before we go to the questions.
Go to the questions.
Okay, good. So look at a lot of things going here. Mark, I'm gonna try and pull some threads together out of this, because we have quite a few, 14 to date. But you know, Mark, around multidiscipline, Tracy mentioned this, multidisciplinarity, new areas, stuff like that. You know, as I said, you know, the councils are moving into this space with colleagues. We're testing out what these programs should look like. We're going to talk more about that at CSPC. NFREF, for example, was actually born, developed, and bred in consultation with the community. So it's a step in that direction. What you're going to get to attacking these really more complex, deep-rooted, high-risk, you know, high-reward questions. I walk on the campus of some universities, and they're looking at me and saying, and these are our colleagues, and these are people we fund, and they're saying, well, you know, is disciplinary research dead? And I said, hell no. Like, in fact, you know, we definitely need deep disciplinary research in key areas, and that's got to continue. And, you know, the question will become, Mark, and for government funding, what's the balance? But we're not done, and we're going to do more, and we're definitely listening. So we can talk about that a little bit more. There was an interesting question on the U.S. experience being relevant to Canada. I'm going to open that up and say, who gets it right, guys? Like on the panel, anybody? Like we talk about this once in a while, but not that often. And sometimes it's kind of it's not always accurate. Like, are there countries that get it right?
The
get it better?
the Scandinavian countries are pretty good at this. I mean, we have very sophisticated engineering societies. We have very sophisticated scientific societies. We have a close integration of industry, union, and society, and very strong social values driving innovation, technology, industry, and social issues. And we have governments and policies in the Scandinavian countries that support that. So I'm talking Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. Those places actually do very well. And if you go there, things actually work more or less. There are other social issues that need to be addressed in all of those places, but from engineering and technology and data perspective, they tend to work quite well. Now, what that looks like in terms of granting councils, I can't say, because I can't say that my area of research is looking at what granting councils do, but it seems to me that you can pursue pretty critical questions, and you can work with industry partners, work with the public, with NGOs and academia together seem to work quite well in those contexts. I don't see that being very easy here all the time, but that's very big generalizations. You know, there's a lot of specificities, and the devil's always in the detail on how these things play out.
Okay. Hayden, AJ?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a hard question to answer, and unless you've got real knowledge of a particular system, you're generalizing. I mean, the Scandi countries are always held up as models for all sorts of things, but I think as Tracy was hinting at, I mean, you know, you can see the rise of the far right, and they have all sorts of problems with race. Not all of them, but several of them do. So it's not like they've got every issue cracked. I think there are tensions. Also, they're small countries, and I think that there's actually that tends to get underestimated when you look at different social models. Actually, the size of the country often is quite a significant factor that doesn't get looked at. But yeah, I think there are often different economic and social models which lead to quite different sets of outcomes. And you know, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily privilege one over the other, but they do lead you down to different places, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. AJ, you want to comment on that?
Yep, no, nothing to add there.
It's interesting. I did a session like this not long ago and got completely derailed in the first 5 seconds because the person said, "What do you mean by innovation?" I said, "Why the hell are you asking me? I'm the moderator. Like, you know, you guys should figure it out." But it's not a bad question. And what do we mean by success? And how do we measure success? You know, everybody's seen the famous list that Canada is like 15 or 18 on. And, you know, I always say to myself, well, would we be happier if we were number one? Or shouldn't we be happy we're in the top 10%? Because the bottom 90% on a good day, you know, maybe not looking that good. So where are our values in this? And I always ask this question when people talk about innovation, how we have to be more productive, and you know how we run the risk of becoming less wealthy. And the question I always ask is, and why I kind of was wondering about what's happening internationally, is that we never ask the question, which is innovation for what? Like, why do we have to innovate? Like, is it a race? Are we worried, you know, that we're going to get so far behind, our standard of living will fall in such precarious position? I mean, that makes sense with respect to innovating at home and domestically and having the talent that can do that. But, you know, the other thing is you can rip off a lot of IP. You can buy a lot of IP that's being developed elsewhere. The question is how you implement it at home. And if that's your goal. And what do you get out of that? And it's a bigger philosophical question, but it's not one that we usually deal with. So if anybody wants to weigh in on that, that's awesome. But I have something more concrete.
We have some good questions here. We have a lot of questions that we haven't even gotten near of in the chat. Yeah, we got lots of questions there. Maybe we can look at those.
So the other one is that came up a couple of times was this issue of judgment versus managerial experience. And for example, one question, to what extent can judgment be taught to improve the ability of staffers in company support systems? So specifically the trade commissioner services mentioned, but I'd like to get your take on that, maybe AJ, because I think you were talking a bit about that and what that really means, what the implications of that are.
Sure. So we've defined judgment very precisely, like it means a very specific thing, which is the way you can think about it is when you're making a decision, what's the cost of different types of mistakes? And so, for example, if I were to say, you're about to go outside for a walk to work, it's a 20-minute walk. There's a 25% chance of rain. Will you take an umbrella? And if I ask a room of 100 people, usually like 20 people or so will raise their hand and say they'll take an umbrella. And the question is, everybody just got the same fact set. It's a 20-minute walk. They're going to work, and there's a 25% chance of rain. But different people came up with different answers. And why is that? And when you draw out a decision tree, you can point to judgment, which is judgment is the weights that you put on the different outcomes. And so some people put a higher weight on getting wet. Like, in other words, if they take the risk and the bad event happens, then the cost of that mistake for some people is higher than it is for others. And so the question is, can you teach judgment? And so you can imagine, if you work in global affairs or trade, and you make all kinds of decisions all the time, and there's never a clear cut of what's right versus wrong. They're all based on trade-offs. And so how do you learn those trade-offs? And so effectively, where do you develop your judgment? And it can be through schooling. It can be through on-the-job mentoring. It's like all the ways in which you develop the instinct of what are the weights to put on different things in a trade. We're making decisions all the time, and they're often not explicit. And so, especially once we go to start using things like AI, where we'll hand a lot of the kind of mechanical prediction part of decisions to machines, that then we have to explicitly give the machines our values of how do they make these trade-offs. And so, can you learn judgment? In our view, yes. Yes, you can. And the more sophisticated the domain, the more nuanced the way that we learn judgment. Just our debate today was a debate about judgment. So Tracy has some views about like data governance, and I might have views that are different. And how did we both arrive at our views? We were both applying judgment from the things we've read, the values we hold, and not just the things we've read about data, but the things that she and I have read about what makes societies fair, what makes societies productive. Like, all of that ultimately comes down to inform our judgment on how should we govern data. And so, we each say a thing, and we might have different sentences, but underneath those sentences is like an iceberg of stuff, and that is judgment. How do you learn that is a non-trivial process, but yes, absolutely, it can be learned.
Hayden?
I don't have anything to add on the judgment question, but I did see there was a question in there which I think was aimed at me around this issue of, if the UK is an 80% services economy, how is a manufacturing mindset sort of distorting what is done? And I think it's happening across a whole series of things. So, for example, on the skills agenda, you are, as was said earlier, kind of over-indexing on the STEM issue. When you think about the kind of data infrastructures that are being provided, again, or funding, as we've discussed, even kind of, I think, a lot of talk about clusters of businesses, etc. The focus on kind of what is measured are clusters of kind of pharma and life sciences, etc., rather than really having a good handle on what's going on in our creative economies and those sorts of things. So, I think once you've got the wrong narrative at the kind of very high level, it then informs a lot of what is measured, what is funded, etc., and then distorts right the way through the system.
Okay, Tracy, anything last comment on that?
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see on the topic of data governance and judgment and those kinds of issues. If we think in North America, we now have Indigenous data governance. And as a result of sovereignty and truth and reconciliation and those types of activities, we're seeing a lot more support for digital data sovereignty, for example, and sovereignty being articulated as a nation-to-nation type of agreement. And what are we starting to see? We're starting to see Indigenous consultancies emerge. Those are really interesting and innovative in the space of data and technology. We're beginning to see third-party data trust types of providers. If we start thinking of data institutions, we're starting to see Indigenous-led data centers and cloud computing centers that are being supported through more progressive procurement kinds of practices. And all of those things were related to advocacy to advance those types of issues, but also really, really important social science research to advise and to direct that we ought to do those things. We're also starting to see new applications developed. We're starting to see, when we looked at the Smart City Challenge, we started to see cities who had really serious issues to address come up with really fascinating ways to resolve those issues with data and technology and innovation, and working with businesses to be able to do that in all the good ways that we want to see those ways move forward. And again, that is social science informed type of R&D, if you will. It just gets translated in different places that are hard to track, again, from the purposes of SSHRC. Wouldn't necessarily track that has been influential. It might be called knowledge mobilization, but even knowledge mobilization is kind of awkward to track those kinds of real world application areas in data and technology and innovation in those spaces. But I'm finding it very, very exciting to find these new companies emerge and to see what they're doing and where they're located. They're located in the north, they're located in rural and remote communities, and they're really trying to come up with a way to govern technologies and data and new, interesting, and innovative ways, and growing new skills and new knowledge and investing in new businesses. And I think that's exciting. And to me, again, that's all social science research at work on the ground doing good stuff.
So one thing I hear a lot around business school research and what we're doing there and how impactful it is. And business schools, if you ask them, they'll point to the thousands of companies that business school students have started since graduation. Do we have any real data on that? Like, and this is all. So last time I checked, business school was pretty much social science, maybe some humanities. But do we have any data on that and what the impact of that is? Business schools aren't necessarily the biggest source of funding applications within SSHRC. I mean, they do, but a lot don't. So think about that. I want to get to one last set of questions, though, kind of important because there were a couple related to this, and that is the balance between a more fundamental, curiosity-driven research approach and more applied research. And it relates to something Jeff was saying as well, that within the academy, some of us choose to do research that could potentially benefit business or is relevant to business, and some of us don't. But the fact is that in the reward structure, even in engineering or even in the sciences, I can tell you this is true, the work that's more applied may not get or be seen with this as having the same value as work that may be more theoretical. So again, that's back on us a little bit. But what is the balance? I mean, should we be thinking of changing up the balance? I mean, a lot of these things are driven through committees, through collective agreements and so forth. But, how wrong do we have it, within the academy?
I can't obviously comment on the Canadian situation, but in the UK, clearly there's a move towards more focus on innovation. I think the thing that we would stress is the importance of having a diversity of funding in the landscape, because and that's not just about business, non-business, or particular disciplines, but it's also about how you fund. So, for example, we have our research councils, the equivalent of yourselves, but we as academies also fund, and we fund in rather different ways. So we fund fellowships much more. The British Academy's got a small research grants program, which gives out a high volume of kind of very small grants, which, as you know, in humanities and social sciences can go quite far. I think that actually, no funder individually can ever predict all the things that need doing and the right ways of doing it, which is why having a multiplicity of funding streams. We also have we've just rejoined the Horizon program at the European level, which we're delighted about. And that again provides a different kind of funding. So that I think, answering at the kind of level of what is a healthy funding ecosystem, I think is probably more productive than saying what should any particular funder's balance of funding be.
Okay, no, that's important.
Sometimes I wonder,
Go ahead.
we have a lot of known solutions to a lot of common problems, but it's not innovative to apply those, is it? And so we understand what sustainability is. We understand what the environment's about. We understand what good immigration policy to pick up what or good social policy is, and bringing people, newcomers into countries. Think of the Scandinavian countries. We've been doing that research for a very, very long time in many places in the world, but it is not considered innovative to apply the research we already know, unless we can spin it as something new. And so I wonder if innovation is maybe using the term in a lot of our funding research is maybe part of the problem, because it's always looking for something new, and the application of something old that works in a new place is not considered innovative, for example.
Wow.
In our
back to my point.
yeah, so our open smart cities, one of the fifth principle was that not all complex social issues require technological solutions, that sometimes it's incredibly innovative, or the application of old methodologies from the social sciences and from social theory will help us resolve those kinds of problems. And that would also be part of what a smart city is, right? Smart cities shouldn't always be tech driven. It should be these other things as well. So, and that kind of thinking is really hard to apply. It's really hard to get funding for applied social policy. Very, very difficult to get, let alone tech, let alone critically thinking about tech or critically building tech, if you will. These other areas are even less, right? Innovative social work. Nobody puts money there. These are really important things with really important issues that we have on the ground. And these different areas of, in the social sciences are critically important to us. And we have almost nothing from those particular areas as well, because it's all an innovation agenda. And so I think like the complexity that we are dealing with in our societies requires more than just data and tech. It requires these other ways of thinking that may not be business set. And that is where the social sciences can actually help us. And I think the community research and business research aspects of it can also be really, really helpful.
So Jeff has already warned me that he's going to cut me off from my moderator role at the top of the hour, and he wants to say a few words. So I would just give each of you like the one single thing we got to know out of this whole discussion today, please, in like 30 seconds. Hayden, you want to start, and AJ, and Tracy?
Yeah, as I said, I think as I started, actually, although there's lots of tactical solutions, we've got to start at the narrative level. So if people have imbibed the notion that technology is the thing that will answer the problems that we've got, then lots of other things will flow from that. And I think that's not a helpful narrative. Whereas actually, if we can show that the social judgment, as has been discussed today, the creative, all of these things are the things that we need to place a premium on, then we will design our systems differently.
Very good point. AJ?
I'm just going to draw on a point here that was raised earlier. Somebody talked about the vaccine and how that relied on earlier, more basic research. That's true. And as I remarked, I'm a big advocate for basic research. There's another part to that story, which is a lot of research then went into turning that into a usable vaccine. and an incredible amount of research. And there are many research teams working at a feverish pace in parallel. And this summer everybody saw the Oppenheimer film, and I would ask the SSHRC community, what would a Manhattan Project in the social sciences look like? In other words, if we needed to take our craft as social scientists and humanities and point it at solving a first order immediate problem, what would we do? Like, what would we point it at, and why do we think we'd have a chance to move the needle on it? And so, to the extent that we have this pastures quadrant, so I'm not talking about the people that are doing basic foundational research, but the people that are doing research to both advance our knowledge and have a use for society. That you could imagine in Canada, we could pick one or two or three things, and how would we stimulate the kind of um, initiative thrust that we had for either the vaccine, which is remarkable, or Manhattan Project for social sciences, because it feels like the world could use something like that at a time like this. That's it for me.
So that's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, Tracy, you got 15 seconds because Jeff's given me the evil eye.
My answer to AJ would be climate adaptation and homelessness in the context of Canada would be the two things. But at the end of the day, the things that I think about all the time in the work that I do is what's the world I want and how do I get there? Not just the world I don't like, which is the critique often in the social sciences. We critique, but we don't construct and build the world we want. So what's the world we want? And then how do we step back from there to find the way to actually get us there? And of course, is it the right world that we're actually aspiring
to? We did end up back on that philosophical note, which I so enjoyed. So anyway, thanks to all our panelists and thanks to everyone who joined today. The questions phenomenal. I know I didn't do them all justice. You can blame me. We get blamed for a lot of things. You can blame
we won't blame you. You were great too. Thanks to all of you. Tracy really hit the nail on the head. Our conference next April, the title is Reverse Engineering the Future. And how do we envision the future we want in 15 years? And how do we reverse engineer to get back to it? And that's what we're looking at. So Tracy, thank you very much for validating it. That's what our next conference will be. So keep your eyes peeled. I want to address several points. One way to solve Tracy's problem about the granting councils, Ted, have a mix of stakeholders on your peer review committees. Not only theoretical scholars, have business people, have community
leaders. They're there.
Yeah. And the more we do, but I think they're still dominated. The granting councils are teachers of the academics, and we have to change that up. In terms of how industry can help, CREAC is an interesting model where you have the chief technology officer of a tech company goes into a university. The graduate students and the faculty sign non-disclosure agreements, and the CTO says, here's where we want to go in 5 years, and they have a discussion, and sometimes a research project comes out of it, which the company funds, and maybe some of the academics get scholarly. In terms of judgment, when you first told us about judgment, AJ, you said, and where do we go for judgment? People who have done it before. And that's really important because it's experience that gives you wisdom, which is really what allows you to make good judgments. And that's why mentorship works, because it's someone who has the experience and has failed and has pivoted and done all those things that you have to do. So it's really judgment. I would equate to wisdom, which only comes from experience rather than just schooling and stuff. That's important as well. And finally, to the innovation point, Ted's the definition of innovation. Read the OECD manual. They talk about innovation being incremental as well. It's not always new to the world. It could be new to the company. It could be new to the person. It could be new. It could be a new way of doing things with things that you already have. So innovation is really about, and some of you use this terminology, which I love, it's about creating value for someone, making life better for someone with what you have. And that's really what innovation is. And so often people use this linear model of from idea to market. That's what innovation is.
Probably AJ knows this, but if you talk to enough companies, I've talked to a lot of companies in Southwestern Ontario, you know, they're OEM suppliers. You make that pitch to them, and what they say to you is, oh, that's all very interesting, but I'm making money now.
Well, exactly. And that's what Peter Nicholson wrote about. He says
What's
we're a
the
low
point?
But there are companies, R&D intensive companies in Canada that are amazing, but they sell too early, and we
Yeah,
have to.
you got it. You got
So
it.
there's a lot of issues.
That's a whole other issue. That's a whole other
Thank
question.
all of you. You were great, Tracy and AJ and Hayten and Ted. Thanks so much. Tune into our webinar on Thursday with FRQ, and watch out for our conference, and we'll do these things more. Thanks everyone for participating. You're all great. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bonne soirée de Bruxelles.
Thank you.
À
Thank you
la
so much.
prochaine.